And now I would like, if I may, to say a little bit about this planning appeal, which I think you will agree with me has certainly been unusual. I suppose it is really, I'm correct in saying it's the first, it may be the second planning appeal under the new aegis in which environment has been separated from planning. Now, of course, it isn't difficult to ascribe the government's act in shifting the environment ever further and further away from the instruments of decision in our state. It's not difficult to understand why, because environment always involves people. It involves communities, and communities and people are difficult. They're unpredictable. You can't actually control them 100% however much you try. And so they make a nuisance themselves, and so it has been shifted further and further away. And that is why we find ourselves in this strange situation today, when the incinerator has assumed a most extraordinary character. Sometimes our deliberations here, I would say, have been absurdist. Sometimes they've been surreal. Sometimes they've been Thomastic or Suffolk. Many of the exchanges between yourself, Mr. Inspector, and Mr. Loughnan would have been appropriate in the philosophy schools of medieval Padua or 9th century Baghdad. And this is because the incinerator itself, because of the constraints on the terms in which we may discuss it, has become an unquantifiable entity. I mean, it burns, it consumes, but it has no emissions for the purposes of this inquiry. It has actually assumed its own Platonic character, the ideal incinerator as imagined by its proposers. I suppose we must appeal the construction of an ideal incinerator that can never exist and will have been placed in Ringaskiddy to be run by these builders, the angels, since we can't reveal or discuss the true competence or otherwise of the part or the past character of the firm seeking to run it. As far as the board is concerned, the proposed incinerator might be operated by leprechauns or psychopaths or retired jockeys even, so that with no emissions, no effects, and no staff at all. Indeed, Mr. Meehan, the planner, invited us to think of it as a wind farm, which it might as well be for all that it can resemble an incinerator under these terms. And a lot of people find this very irritating, Mr. Inspector, but speaking personally, I welcome it. I welcome it because our discussions here have involved us really in the search for quiddity, for the whatness of an incinerator. What actually are we doing here? What actually is our appeal? What is it we're appealing against? And I would say that this is something rarely considered at planning appeals, where we get bogged down in dioxins and air emissions, air modelling, water emissions, all the other things we can't discuss. Our appeal drifts on into that complex and technical world where few of us are competent to follow. And the actual true nature of why we are all met here together, Mr. Inspector, lawyers, members of the community, and members of the general public, gets lost and forgotten. But on this occasion, by a supreme stroke of poetic irony, the government has afforded us the opportunity to get right down to it. And what we find is that, Mr. Inspector and your board, you've been asked actually to adjudicate on a point of principle. That is to say, whether it should allow itself to be used as a kind of battering ram to set aside, to smash the express wishes of an electorate as expressed through their elected representatives. Because the electorate of East Cork have, through their elected representatives, rejected this in conformity with this development plan, this agreement, this basis for going forward. And you are being looked for as another arm of state to override that, and override the community's wishes in this regard. And I would say that that is a very, very, very serious crossroads, really, in our democratic system at the moment. Now, Mr. Meehan, the planner, he said, and I heard him, and the record will show when you play the tape, he has told you that you must do so, and that we must accept this incinerator. And I wonder, Mr. Inspector, if you agree with me when I heard those words. I was reminded actually of an historical occasion when the great Lord Cecil told Queen Elizabeth I of England that she must get married. And you remember her reply, little man, must is not a word to use to princes. And I would suggest to Mr. Inspector it's not a word to use to planning inspectors. And